I talked at the end of the last session about the growing industrial power of France and Germany and the United States becoming competitive with the world's first industrial power, Great Britain. Let's look at the implications of that economic growth, especially as it pertains to Africa. Rapid industrialization means this. Rapid industrialization means that a given industry can produce more goods in less time with less labor. And so what you have with the rapid industrialization of France and Germany and the United States, with Britain already in that place, what you have is a situation wherein a number of competitors in each industry are producing more and more goods, more and more rapidly, with less and less labor, and not in regard to the needs or the demands of the market which that production is being conducted for, but rather in conformity with the demands of the particular owners of each individual corporation. Now, each individual corporation wants to capture the maximum market share. And so the result of all this production and the fact that there is no controlling interest in that production other than the interest of wanting to capture maximum market share, the result of that is that more goods pour onto the marketplace than that marketplace can consume. When that happens, we enter into what economists call a crisis of overproduction. Overproduction means that there are more goods on the marketplace than the marketplace can consume. If I'm an individual business owner and I'm producing, let's say, shoes, and all these thousands and tens of thousands of pairs of shoes are not selling on the marketplace, I've got to stop production. I stop production, I have to fire workers or lay off workers. If I lay off workers, that means that those people aren't being paid. If those people aren't being paid, they don't have money to buy. The market in the individual countries begins to shrink. As the market shrinks, the crisis of overproduction becomes still greater and spreads from one industry to the next. So in the beginning, in the middle of the 19th century, and then more and more markedly as the century progresses, there are a series of crises of overproduction. We call those crises of overproduction depressions. The leaders of each of these respective countries came to understand these crises of overproduction, and all of them developed similar solutions to that crisis. And the solution that they all came up with was that the best way to avert a crisis of overproduction was to expand one's markets, which means that Britain has to have overseas markets, and France has to have overseas markets, and Germany, and Holland, and the United States. Given, however, the growing equality between the industrial power of Britain's still dominant, but a growing equality of industrial power with France, a growing industrial equality with Germany, given that very rough equality, the only way that each of those individual nations could secure markets abroad from competitors was to establish control over those markets. That is to say, was to establish colonies. What I'm trying to describe here is the economic underpinning to why it is that at the end of the 19th century, you have this unprecedented scramble for colonies, the scramble for Africa. There's another factor that shapes the demand for colonies in Africa. As industrialization proceeds in each of these countries, the number of competitors in a given industry, the number of different corporations in a different industry slowly narrows down. And instead of many corporations, many companies producing in the same industry, more and more it's 2, 3, or 4 major companies producing in a single industry and dominating that industry and preventing smaller competitors from entering into production in that industry. In this context, with a handful of industries producing massive quantities of goods, industrial survival increasingly depended upon control over raw materials. Now, what is true is that in this period of time, the late 19th century, Europeans did not have a good sense of the kind of raw materials Africa contained. What they did know was this, was that it contained raw materials, it had to contain raw materials that were vital to industry, and it was also a threat to, let's say, British industry to allow French industry to take large swaths of Africa and take control potentially over raw materials that were key to the survival and the growth of industry in Britain. And so what I am saying here is that this demand for access to raw materials is another goad, another stimulus to the colonization of Africa, the seizing of control over African peoples. Moreover, the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Dutch increasingly came to believe the argument made by a French economist in the 1870s. His name was Leroy Belleau. And Monsieur Belleau Monsieur Belleau said this, that the domination that Britain held over most of Europe during the first part of the 19th century was based on Britain's control. It wasn't at that time in terms of Africa a colonial control, but it was a real control nonetheless, was the control that Britain had over large swaths of the world. That the economic and the political and the military power of the British was based in the fact that Britain was the world's largest empire, and that the path to power within Europe, the path to power for the French or the Germans or the Dutch or any other people, that the path to power lay in the path of empire, creating empire. Colonialism is one form of empire. Thus, we see from a number of angles the pressures leading Europe to attempt to colonize Africa. By the 1870s, as European forts began to appear on the coast of Africa, and many of these forts were the remnants of slave trading, were the continuation of the forts that had been established during the slave trade. By the 1870s, with these forts dotting the coast of Africa, I think that it's clear, if you look at all these pressures building for colonization, that if a single European power moves to dominate an area of Africa, all these other powers have to jump in and follow suit. I will continue with some of the practical elements involved in forcing or compelling Europe to continue its colonization in our next session. Sumarera, Obagora. There, Obagore.